all you.
All right, thanks. And yes, especially with this one, what I'm going to cover is my workflow and kind of some advice based on all the files that I receive for printing, that maybe if some editing changes were made, we'd have a better print. But of course, when you're editing an image, it's all about your aesthetics and what you saw when you took the photo and that whole feel through the process. So this is not a set of rules that you have to abide by. These are just, I think, things to be aware of. And a lot of the tools that we have, especially with software, are really easy to overuse if you don't know what to look for. So you can end up kind of degrading your file when you're editing versus making it better as you go along. So the editing workflow that I'm going to use for this is going to be in Photoshop Camera Raw, but these ideas apply no matter what editing software you use. None of this is Adobe specific. None of this is, it all carries across to everything. And whether you use a free raw file editor or anything else, you can apply the same techniques. The idea that kind of the flow of this is working from raw, doing some basic edits. When you're editing your image, you want to know what parts of that image or what tones or what's important to you and important to what you want to say to the viewer. Then two of the key pieces that are addressed in the raw file are sharpening and noise reduction. And those are the easiest ways to get into trouble when it comes to making a print. And then we'll look at soft proof and gamut and some strategies when you're printing, and for proofing on a small desktop printer if you're making larger prints, so you don't have to repeatedly make giant prints to see if you got it right. There's some things you can do making little smaller prints that translate really well. So this is a 3-image composite that was shot handheld, and this is I'm using this as an example because one of the great tools that we have now is that with a fast burst rate in a camera and software, it's really easy to do these, they're technically HDR, but it's just a stop under, a stop over, and a properly exposed image, and to merge them together. And in a situation like this, where you can't really stop, you certainly can't bring a tripod, but there's bright sun in the stained glass, there's dark shadows around the edges. It gives us the opportunity to get that little bit more dynamic range that we wouldn't necessarily get out of one exposure. And it also can present some new little challenges. So this was it as it was originally merged. Generally, when I'm working with these HDR images, I do let Photoshop do its auto adjustments as a start, so I can kind of see what's in my file and then tinker with it from there. And inevitably for me, Photoshop always oversaturates and overdoes the blacks. So I'm going to set that back to 0. But I picked this image for a few reasons. Number one, it has a lot of detail in the stone and in the top, but because it's in a cathedral and it's dark, I had to shoot it at ISO 4000. So there's a fair amount of noise in here too. So we have to work with balancing the noise reduction and the detail at this point. Then also there's how much do we want to sharpen it? And then we'll have to make some trade-offs here between, say, recovering some of the highlights in the windows versus maybe losing some detail here in the corners. So when I first look at this image, what really matters to me is this center third with the windows, with the stonework, with the statues down here. And then as we work out from that, the flags are pretty straightforward. Those aren't much of a challenge. They're large, they're blocks of color. We're not going to have to mess with that. And then down in the corner here, we have all this carved woodwork. And for me, for my aesthetic for this image, the carved woodwork is sort of the least important. So as I work on this, I might kind of block up the shadows down here or lose some of this detail because it's not really important to the viewer interacting with the image. And I think one thing that we're often led to do working on our files is to make everything a similar value range and to make sure that we have detail everywhere, when that's maybe not necessarily how it was when I took the photo, and it's not important to appreciating the print. So the first thing is to go through and make your standard adjustments. And this is all based on how you feel about it. And if I look, so for instance, if I pull the highlights way down, the windows may look a little better, but it really flattens the stone. So I'm going to back my highlights off so that the stone is where I want it. And then we'll go back and address those windows. And again, here, I'm going to bring the shadows down a little bit because I don't want the corners to be that distracting to me. Okay, now to address the windows, I'm going to do a quick mask because that's one of the, in more recent software, that's one of the great kind of gifts that we've gotten, is that we can now do these masks in RAW and do some really interesting work that used to take a lot of time and effort before we had this ability. And again, I'm not going to be perfect about this because that could take a while, and I'm not trying to create my masterpiece, just to walk all of you through things that you can work on your own images. And as always, we will record this webinar, so if you want to go back and take a look at it a few times or go and address some certain areas of it, you'll absolutely be able to do that. I'm just going to quickly grab these up here. And I'm doing this mask, as I mentioned, because if we go ahead and drop the highlights globally on the image, it affects a lot of things that I don't want to mute or to kind of lose some brightness values with.
And Devin, can you review quickly how you got the mask?
Yeah, so if you're working in Camera Raw, and there's a couple different layouts, but in the layout that I have here, on the very far right are the tools. So the standard little sliders are at the top, and those are all the adjustments we're used to. The fourth option down is masking. And then you can create masks in here with brushes, gradients. They now have select sky and select subject. There's a lot of Adobe tutorials on how to use these masks. But then when we roll over them here, we can I can see where that mask is. Okay, so returning back to the normal tools, I'm going to brighten this up a little bit. So then in the tools here, there's texture, clarity, and dehaze. And these three sliders, I like to say, are kind of like the top of the food pyramid, right? The use sparingly section, because texture and dehaze are things that can kind of quickly get you into quality trouble. And again, whenever you're doing fine adjustments, or next we'll get to sharpening and noise reduction, you always want to zoom in to 100%. And that's right down here in the lower left, because that way you're looking at your image at the actual pixel size. What's made editing a real challenge is I'm working on a newer MacBook Pro. So because there's so much pixel density in the screen, what am I at, 47%, I can turn the dehaze way up and I can turn that texture up. And suddenly, to me here, it looks very precise. It becomes a very sharp file. But as I zoom in, I've done a lot of kind of what I would call damage to the image. I've crushed up the gradients a bit so they're not smooth. I've kind of accentuated the noise. So while it looks good at low magnification, when you zoom in all the way, it doesn't actually treat the file well. So these three sliders, again, if you're going to use them, or if you are using them, go ahead and zoom that image in to 100% and then make some of those edits, because these are all kind of local contrast and other things that will cause those pixels to really stand out. And I usually like just a little bit of clarity because it helps to kind of define some of the structures in the image, but again, not too much. So those are my basic edits, and I'm very happy with those. Once you do all those basic edits, then step down here to detail, and this is your sharpening and your noise reduction. And I always recommend doing your noise reduction. Again, you want your sharpening to be the very last thing that you do. And I know a lot of photographers will do a little bit of sharpening in RAW, and then if you're going to go in and do retouching or anything like that, you actually do your final sharpening once you've done those edits in Photoshop, so that you're not doing any work on a sharpened file, because that's kind of the last thing you want to do. And I'm not going to today go into a lot of print sharpening. There are all sorts of techniques that people use, and those are more determined by how big is the print going to be, what kind of paper are you using. That's almost a whole conversation in itself, but there's a lot of resources out there online or in books that if you want to really get into print sharpening, you can do some research on that and figure out what strategy works best for you, for your image, for your subject, all that sort of thing. So with the noise reduction, again, always zoom in. This is even at 200%. And so I can see here that I have some noise in this image, especially in the stone. And again, because we're over Zoom, I don't know how much of this comes through to you, but then if we look down here in these shadows, they're actually pretty clean. And again, I wouldn't want to focus on this shadow area down in the corner when I'm looking at doing my noise reduction, because this is not where my eye is going to travel. Again, it's this center section. So if we zoom back in, we'll do 100% for now. It looks pretty good. Again, I'm going to go into 200, but you can see it's a little soft around these statues. So I'm going to turn the noise reduction up. Again, this is kind of trial and error and what looks good to you. As I turned it up, it got pretty soft. So I'm going to back it down, because this is where you're going to find your balance between how much noise is acceptable in your file. And to get rid of the noise, it tends to blur the pixels together. So how much detail are you willing to lose in order to control that noise? And in these Adobe programs, when you're working in the detail section, if you hold down the Option key, for instance, when you're doing noise reduction, it switches it to black and white. So it's a little easier to see the detail of what you're working on when you're dragging the sliders. And then, so that was the regular noise. And then we can get into color noise reduction. And the one thing that you see in the color noise reduction is this smoothness slider. So again, the amount and the smoothness can be adjusted to kind of get you where you want to go.
Evan, is it true that noise tends to soften the image?
Noise reduction softens the image, yes, no matter what, because it's trying to make those kind of noisy pixels look less apparent by making them similar to the pixels right next to them.
And then I think you did start to do this a little bit later on, but is there a reason why you wouldn't zoom in at 200 as they used to in the old days, do the retouching and then back down to 100%?
You certainly can. I'm used to doing editing on a larger screen. So doing this on this laptop display is actually a little, I would go into 200% at least so I can see, again, because of that really pixel dense screen. You have to zoom in more to get to that sort of same level of detail. And my main goal here is to not lose the detail work in the stonework. So if we take this noise reduction way up, you can see there, it just takes all the detail out of the stone and it makes it look almost spongy. So when I bring it back down kind of to where I was, we still retain that detail versus turning it off all the way. Then you can really see that kind of crunchy noise that's in that part of the file. So the other thing to keep in mind, if you're not really comfortable with these tools, is there's no wrong answer and you're not going to break anything. So go in here and turn it off, turn it up all the way, and see what that does, so you can start to have kind of a muscle memory of what these tools do and what the trade-offs are as you increase or decrease. So now I'm pretty happy with the noise reduction. Whoops. I would like a little more sharpness again in this stone. So now that I've made all my other adjustments, the last thing I'm going to do in Raw is the sharpening. And there's two parts to sharpening. There's the, well, I'm going to narrow it down to two parts. There's basically the amount, which is this top slider, and then there's the masking. And the masking is what part of the image does my sharpening apply to. So if I turn the masking off, I turn the sharpening to 40, you can kind of see that it's almost brought back a little bit of the noise. So what masking does, and again, if I hold down the Option key and slide this, so here's our image. I hold down the Option key, it turns white. What that means is that sharpening is being applied to every pixel in my image. And then as I slide the masking slider up, whatever turns, black and white, that starts to delineate what's being sharpened and what's not. So as I move it up here, I can see, I really just want to sharpen the edges of that stonework. So that looks pretty good. And then again, that 75 was the value that I picked. So we're going to set this to 0. And then I'm going to set it up to 75. So that's a little softer than I want, but because I know that I'm only sharpening the edges now, I can go ahead and increase the amount to then get to the level that I want without kind of introducing artifacting or noise or anything else like that. And again, feel free to experiment with this because it's going to be different based on the contents of your file, the subject of your image, how much noise reduction you had to do, all these other variables, they all balance with each other. So at this level, I'm pretty happy with it. Now, I'm going to zoom out. So our sharpening's at 40 and our masking's at 61. Now, if I had done that without zooming in, it's going to look really good, probably. Yeah. So if I set the masking to 0 and the sharpening to 150 here at, 47%, the image still looks really good. But if I go back and zoom in to that stonework, you can really see that it has just absolutely trashed the image. And I have this detail that looks like sandpaper. And if I were to go ahead and print this image, that sandpaper look would absolutely come through on the print. And to me, I've kind of ruined the file. But again, I wouldn't know that unless I zoomed in, because on this screen zoomed out, it looks beautiful. So keep that in mind too, when you're editing an image. You may go ahead and make a second version, for the web or for Instagram or for whatever else. And you're going to do much more aggressive sharpening and things like that than you would do for a print, because it's a completely different output. But I'm going to go ahead and set this back to where I had it. And then zoom back in. And here I've kept my detail, but I still have that kind of soft, smooth feeling of that stonework. All right, so that image to me is ready to be opened and to move on. Now, I bring this up a lot in the other color management talks and that sort of thing, but again, just looking at Camera Raw, I want to make sure that my color space is Adobe RGB 98, not sRGB, because then I'm limiting my colors. Again, you can use ProPhoto if you want. 8-bit or 16-bit, again, that's up to you, how big you're going to print, how much detail you want. And why is that? 16-bit per channel has a a much richer gradient, a lot more shades of gray. So especially if you're making a big print, starting with a 16-bit file can give you a much better output. It's going to set this to 8-bit for ease and quickness. Again, no output sharpening. So I'm going to select OK, and I'm going to open this image.
Sorry.
Sorry.
A few people are asking, how does the radius affect parts of the image?
Yeah, so the radius, sharpening works by increasing the amount of contrast between neighboring pixels. So at 1, it's looking at the 1 pixel adjacent. And then as you go beyond 1, it's sampling a larger area. So generally, sharpening tends to get chunkier the larger your radius, because it's increasing local contrast, I think, is the easiest way to explain it. So here's that image, and I'll zoom back. There's nothing else at this point that I feel that it needs. I don't need to do any cloning or healing or anything else like that. It looks good in the details. So at this point, I would feel like I'm pretty much ready to print it. So if you're printing an image that has a lot of colors in it that you're not sure if they're in gamut, or if you're using a new paper for the first time, or a newer paper, the next step in the process is to do a soft proof. And what a soft proof does is it shows you the image kind of through the lens of the print profile. So what colors are going to have to be adapted a little bit, what's the black point of the paper you're using, all that sort of thing. And because each printer uses a different ink set and all the papers have different gamuts, it's going to be pretty unique to your paper and ink combination. So in Photoshop, that's View, Proof Setup, Custom. And then that brings up the proof window. The first pull-down menu here, Device to Simulate, is where you choose your print profile. So this should just say ICT profile. Selected here is the Juniper Baryta Rag on the Canon Pro 300, which is actually one of the desktop printers here behind me. And then for rendering intent, the two that you're going to use when you're printing are perceptual and relative colorimetric. And what rendering intent is it's how is the software going to take the out of gamut colors and move them in gamut. Relative colorimetric is going to be more screen accurate because it's only going to change the out of gamut colors, whereas perceptual is going to keep all the color relationships even and move everything just a little bit. So the general rule of thumb is that for not a lot of out of gamut colors, relative colorimetric is going to be your better bet. If you have a lot of out of gamut colors, then perceptual is going to give you a more aesthetically pleasing and accurate print.
And before
So
we
now,
move forward with this, we do have a few questions about the editing. So would the process be similar in Photoshop than in Camera Raw?
Well, the reason why we do all this in Camera Raw is because it is a raw file, so you have a lot more latitude. So if you're just trying to do your noise reduction and your sharpening and stuff in the Photoshop interface, either you're working with something like an out of camera JPEG, or maybe you have an old file that you want to work on. So yes, the process is the same, but generally your quality is going to be better if you do it from the raw file and not farther down the workflow route.
And what happens if you sharpen the edges in Photoshop? Only the edges.
So that's not something you can do in Camera Raw, if I remember correctly. That's a filter, sharpen edges. It appears that it doesn't give you any options and it just does it. So let's see. It doesn't seem to have made much difference here, but I'm always kind of suspicious and hesitant to use an option that just doesn't or a tool that doesn't give me any options. Do I want more? Do I want less? Where is it going to do it? I don't know. It's like a stamp and move on. So, but again, if Sharpen Edges works in your workflow and you like how it looks, then it's not a wrong answer. But I like tools that give me the control to say how much I want and how aggressive and where to do it.
Could you switch back and forth from Raw to Photoshop?
You can open files as smart objects, but that's a little beyond my expertise with Photoshop. That gives you some ability to go back and forth, but typically the workflow is one direction from Camera Raw into Photoshop. So you want to make all your basic adjustments once before you open the image. And you can obviously go back, but then you're going to open a new copy of it once you make changes.
And then we do have some questions going into the soft proofing process. So we'll start with this and then we'll get into it. But why not use the Photoshop print module with gamut warning instead of soft proofing?
So the big difference there is twofold, and we'll look at this right now. So again, view proof setup custom. This gives me device to simulate my rendering intent. I can select or deselect the simulate paper color. We'll talk about that. And I can turn this on and off. So I'm going to set that for now. Quickly, we'll look at the print window. The biggest challenge that I've had with the print window in the versions of Photoshop that I've used lately is the image preview is often blurry. So that doesn't bode well for checking things, number one. I think that's more of a Mac problem than a global problem, but it's plagued me for many versions. And sorry, I'm just going to set this so we have a square there. The other reason why I don't like to soft proof here is because I can't zoom in and I can't necessarily see it as well. So yeah, you can do it here, but it's more of a brute force tool. It's more of a hammer than a paintbrush. I don't have those subtle options that I have available in a soft proof. I'm going to go back. So again, view proof setup custom. So the Juniper Baryta is a semi-gloss paper, so it has a larger gamut and more shadow detail than, say, a matte cotton paper would. So that's why we're starting with this. And if I toggle this preview on and off, you should be able to see that the image gets just a little darker when I turn it on, and that's mainly because the simulate paper color. Paper, because it uses reflected light versus emitted light from a screen, paper will never appear quite as bright as your monitor just because of the physics of light. So that's why when you check simulate paper color, it makes it just a little bit darker. And now that I have done that and I select OK, I can go back to view gamut warning, and that is going to show me what's out of gamut. Now, for me, that pops up as this fluorescent pink. The default color in Photoshop for gamut warning is kind of a medium gray, but because medium gray is something that I may encounter a lot in images, it didn't jump out at me enough. So you can actually go into your preferences, transparency and gamut, I believe. Yes. So Photoshop preferences, transparency and gamut, and you can set your gamut warning color here to anything you want. So I always go in and make it, a really unnatural pink so that it shows up immediately. So what this tells me looking at it here is printing on the Juniper on this printer, almost this whole image is in gamut, and the few colors or tones that are not really have no bearing on how the print looks. So I'm not going to get an unpleasant surprise, or I'm not going to want to look at a different paper because the gamut isn't there. So I'm going to go back to that soft proof and see, well, what if we put it on the photo matte, the LaSalle photo matte. So that's a cellulose matte paper. I'm going to switch to that. And you can see how much of a difference just changing the paper makes. And again, this is because a cellulose matte paper has a smaller gamut than a semi-gloss Baryta does. But again, it's not as critical here. Obviously, the blues and the reds and the flags, I can't print those one-to-one. But if they're not a one-to-one match to what's on the screen, it's not like I'm changing a skin tone or something else like that, or a brand color that's really essential to have extremely accurate in the print. So this is where it kind of becomes an aesthetic decision of, what do I want to get out of the paper when I print it? And what are the trade-offs I'm willing to have to get there? And then for a third one, let's look at Entrada Natural and see what changes. Okay, so the blues came back in, the deeper blues. The red's going to change a little bit, but not a lot more than that. So I would lean on this image, just looking at the proof, I would lean toward the Entrada if I wanted it on a matte paper, because I'm going to get this deeper, richer blue that would not be available to me in the photo matte. But the Juniper is what I had planned to print this image on initially, not necessarily because it has the widest gamut, but because it's going to give me a little more detail in this woodwork and a little more kind of richness in the stone and that sort of thing that I think are really important to the print. All right, how do we do on our soft proof questions?
You do have a question. How do you change the gamut to keep the colors printable?
So you don't. You can, but you don't. That's the beauty of the rendering intent. So I could go in here and try to do a color or a luminance specific mask that just addresses these places that are out of gamut. But instead, I'm going to rely on the software and the rendering intent and how all that works. And what the rendering intent's going to do is it knows the gamut of the paper on that printer based on the ICC profile. And it's going to go in and modify these colors for me to the closest in gamut equivalent. So I don't have to do any work, and it's going to give me the best alternative. And so as we talked about the difference between the two rendering intents, if I go back to that photo matte, in this case, instead of using relative color metric, I would switch to perceptual, because if I use relative color metric in here, it's not going to change this blue that's in gamut. And I can zoom in. So relative color metric is only going to change the color that's highlighted in the pink. Turn that off. So you can see it's a pretty consistent shade, or sorry, gamut of dark blue. Whereas if I choose perceptual, what it's going to do is, in order to keep that gradient consistent, it's going to change the in-gamut blue a little bit so that this looks as close to the screen image in terms of general aesthetic. So this is when I would switch to perceptual instead of relative color metric, to make sure that these flags have a nice consistent gradient and look really smooth. If you have a gradient color that's mostly out of gamut and you print it in relative color metric, sometimes you can get some kind of harsh transitions in that gradient because it's not smoothing it all out. But that's the power of perceptual with these out of gamut colors. It will keep all that consistent. And if you go in and try to edit those out of gamut colors, you definitely risk creating some haloing and some stair steps and that sort of thing, because you're trying to specifically target one color and you don't just inherently know what's in gamut until you're working in the soft proof. So if I try to make an adjustment with the soft proof on, then I'd have to go back, turn the soft proof off, zoom in, make sure I didn't have any unintended consequences. And I'm doing a lot of work when there's a piece of the software that will just kind of magically do all that work for me.
Is it true that you could not do this quality of soft proofing in Lightroom and could do it all in Canon print software? And why did you use a very high ISO, and what was your exposure as opposed to a long exposure on the tripod?
So in a cathedral, generally you cannot use a tripod. So you have to go handheld. And we had a very short amount of time in here before all the attendees came. So it should be based on these 3 images. So this was a 1/60th, a 2/50th, and 125th. The lens that I had didn't have image stabilization, so that's kind of why I kept it at a 60th, and these were at ISO 4000. So again, it's making the best of that situation and then being able to kind of work with it later, you know, at ISO 640, you know, what, a 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second exposure would have been fantastic, but I would have had to have done that, you know, some sort of handheld way, and it just wouldn't have been possible. So again, photography is all about, you can usually have 2 out of the 3 things you want, but you almost never get 3 out of the 3 things you want to make a great image.
And could you do this quality of soft proofing in Lightroom?
Yes, so Lightroom does give you the same options to it. It just gives you the 2 rendering intents that you need instead of the other 2 that are in Photoshop that are mainly for testing and hard proofing and that sort of thing. So it'll give you the gamut warning, it'll give you the profiles, and it gives you the rendering intent options. So it does give you the same equivalency. The other kind of nice thing about Lightroom that is not present in Photoshop is in Lightroom, this is a soft proof for the output. Lightroom gives you also a soft proof where it shows you what colors in your file are out of gamut for your monitor. So one thing that sometimes happens is you may have a color, I've seen this in greens, where it's in gamut for the print, but it's actually out of gamut for your monitor. So when you print it, you think, well, why did that color change? Well, the color didn't change. You couldn't actually see it right on your screen. So if you're working in Lightroom, that can be a helpful little thing to see, hey, what colors am I looking at that are being shown incorrectly on my screen before I even get to the print.
Someone is having trouble with Slickrock metallic pearl, and when they try to soft proof using the ICC profile using Lightroom, they get a washed out image. So do you have any suggestions for this?
Yep, turn off the simulate paper color option. Because if we go to the challenge with the pearl to some degree, and especially the silver, is that the white point on that paper is, even though it appears bright, the actual value of the white in that paper is a little lower or a little darker than most of the other papers. So I just switched this to metallic pearl. And if I turn the simulate paper color on, you can see it really makes the image appear dark, even though your print isn't going to appear that way. So when you're doing a soft proof, simulate paper color can help, but it's certainly not a spot on indication of how that's going to look. And then, like I mentioned, if you go to the silver, it just absolutely can't handle it because it's reading this dark silver value of the paper color. And, you know, your prints on silver certainly wouldn't look like this, but on your screen, that's the best job it can do as a comparison. So yeah, just toggle that simulate paper color on and off. And as you use a paper more, you'll get used to how it changes the image from your screen to the print a little bit. And you'll start to have that kind of imprint in your mind of, oh, it's going to appear a little less bright because I'm using a matte paper, or it's going to have the same level of shadow detail as my screen, that sort of thing. You'll come to remember that as you print with a specific paper.
Would monitor calibration fix the gamut warning in Lightroom Classic?
It won't fix it, but it will make sure that it's accurate. So a monitor calibration, which is, of course, something that I recommend everyone do before they edit, is monitor calibration makes sure, using that hardware device, that the color you see on the screen matches the appropriate value. So in digital, whether it's on the screen, on the paper, in the camera, color is defined in a three-dimensional graph, and each color has a specific numerical value in that space. So when you calibrate your monitor, it makes sure, for instance, that whatever the value of this red is in the file, that's the value that's reflected on your screen, or that's shown on your screen. So once you have made a monitor profile, Lightroom reads that monitor profile, and that's what shows you the monitor gamut warning in Lightroom. So it is an accurate representation, and calibrating your monitor won't change that, but it will ensure that it is accurate. All right, so the last step is to print this. If I'm just going to print it, at a regular size, or at a size that I can easily print here, because I've done the work, I've zoomed in, I've done the soft proof, I can be really confident that that print is going to come out the way I want it. So I'm not going to do a small print, or what you'd call a hard proof, because I've done that work on screen, and I'm going to say, no, I'm just going to go ahead and print this image, and I know I'm going to be happy with it. So again, it's the Juniper Baryta on the Canon Pro 300. Because I have almost no gamut warning, I'm going to leave this at relative colorimetric with black point compensation. Black point compensation takes any shadow tones that are darker than the black point of the paper, so they would print straight black, and it adjusts them a little bit so that the shadows retain their detail in the print. Again, because of the way these work in perceptual, that's not a factor because of the way it works, but in relative colorimetric, you always want to check black point compensation. And if you get a print where the shadows are just super muddy, it's probably because you forgot to turn that on. And now I just want it to fit on a letter. And then my media setting, which here's the profile. We put the media setting initials at the end of the profile. Of course, all the media settings are listed on our profile download page on the website, but this is 4 Ps. So it's Photo Paper Pro Platinum. And then because we're doing a live demo here, I'm going to leave it at standard so it prints a little faster. Save and print. So the other tool that makes proofing larger images a lot easier is, for instance, if I wanted to send this out and I wanted a 24 by 36, but all I have available to me is a printer that maxes out at 13 by 19, I can't do a full proof print before I send it out to a print provider and pay a good amount of money for a large print. So what we can do here is make a couple of small test prints of the image, but pieces of the image at that output size to check on the things that might be of concern in our final image. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this. Just for now, I'm going to make my dimensions 24 by 36. And when I do that, it drops my resolution to 143. Now, again, final output resolution, if we're doing small prints, 5 by 7s, 8 by 10s, even an 11 by 14, I don't like to go any lower than 240 pixels per inch because your viewing distance is really close. And if you're missing data in there, it's going to be really apparent. But the larger the print, the farther back the viewing distance. So technically, the less overall resolution that you need for the print to still have a really sharp appearance. So my first concern would be, hey, I don't know how this is going to look at 143 pixels an inch if I print it 24 by 36. So I'm going to say okay to this. I haven't changed the file because I didn't select resample. I'm just kind of resetting the parameters in Photoshop. So now I have this sized to 24 by 36. When I go back to print, I'm going to deselect down here scale to fit media. And then I have to put back in that I want this 24 by 36. So here is my 8.5, 11 letter sheet, but the image, of course, is much larger. So I can actually move around this preview. And I know from looking at the file, the really important areas to me, like I've said, are that center third of the image. How are the statues going to print? How's the stained glass going to print? How's the sandstone work going to print up here? So if I were going to send this out, but I wanted to double check, again, I'm going to leave my print scaled to 2436, but on an 8.5, 11 sheet of paper, I can just print this one section and see how it looks. And again, you're going to do this, say you have a landscape and maybe there's shadowed trees in the foreground that aren't super critical that those have a lot of detail, but there's a mountain range or a ridge in the middle of your photo, and that's where you really want to make sure that you've got it nailed. You can use this same technique to just pick out that section of the image and print it, and then you'll see kind of a little preview window of what that big print's going to look like without the time and expense of actually making a big print to do a proof. All right. Questions?
You do have some questions. How can I get the soft proof image? Where do I place it and how do I retrieve it?
So when you do a soft proof, it doesn't save sort of a snapshot. It's a live thing. So because the pink here, I can see that it's still on. And up here at the top of the screen, it gives my file number. And then it says RGB 8-bit and then Moab Juniper Brighter Rag. So this is telling me that I'm viewing it through the soft proof for this profile. So if I go back to view proof setup custom, I can see that this is still active. I can turn off preview and that will turn off the soft proof. I would also need to go in and turn off the gamut warning. But that tool is always here for you to toggle on, toggle off, but you can't save without doing, say, just a generic screenshot. You can't save the appearance of that soft proof.
Do you ever use resample?
Yeah, and that's something that that there are different ways to do it. There's now when you're converting from RAW, Adobe offers what they call super resolution, which is 4 times magnification. Again, the better the file you start with, of course, the better the interpolation is down the road. And then you can go in when you do that image size and check resample and then increase your pixel count. And there are different schools of thought on this. The old standard was that you would do it 10% at a time. So you can actually go in here, you can go to percent, and you can say, well, I want to do it 110. And then you do 110 again and again and again. And some photographers that I work with absolutely swear by that because you're only doing 10% increments. They feel that it keeps more detail as you go larger. Some people just go ahead and say, man, I want it to be 150 because those are the pixel dimensions I need. I'm just going to do that. But if you are resizing or interpolating an image, you absolutely want to keep an eye on the bigger you go, you're inevitably going to have some quality and detail loss because the software is having to make up those pixels that don't exist. So at what point does that loss of detail even out to not interpolating the image and just going with the native resolution in a print? And again, that's something that is going to be really image dependent, and there's no real law for that one way or the other. So here's our print of the full size, and it came out really well. And because I didn't over sharpen it or over noise reduction, it's not smooshy and it doesn't look like sandpaper. So I hit my objective for that print.
Do you ever use high instead of standard when printing?
I do. And like I said, I just use standard here because it's faster. And that common misperception is that the higher the quality, the more ink it uses. That's not true, because if it were to just use more and more ink, we'd overload the paper. What the different qualities do is the higher the quality, the more times the print head goes over the same place on the paper. So it can actually place the dots closer together, which is why it gives you a higher resolution, especially if you have an Epson in the specs. It'll say, 1440, 2880, that sort of thing. Every time it goes over, it puts down less ink, so it can drop those dots closer together, and that's what gives it the higher resolution. So again, the bigger your print, the larger those gradients, the more a higher quality setting is going to matter to the output. At 8x10, I really haven't seen any difference between standard and highest, or quality 4 and quality 5 on the newer Epsons, that sort of thing. There's just not enough space in there to be able to see it. But at a 2436 or even larger, it does make a big difference, because it's really filling in those areas. So before we do any more questions, this was that little piece of the image at 2436. So you can see here in the 8x10, it's just this little center area. But when I look at this piece of it, I can see, I do have nice detail in the stonework. I haven't over sharpened it. I've gotten the noise out. So if I were to send this out for a big print, I would be confident that I would get a file that I was happy with, and I wouldn't get this big expensive print and go, oh no, what have I done? I have to do it again. So this sort of little preview prints is a great way to proof a larger image at low cost and with the equipment that you have just in your home studio.
You mentioned the M1 you're using. If you're using the Apple M1 chip, does it take the created monitor profile from an outside party, for example, X-Rite, or force you to take the Apple built-in profile?
Well, I've calibrated this screen, and this is an M1. So no, your monitor uses whatever color profile you've assigned to it. So if you have a fresh computer out of the box, it's going to use whatever the Dell or the Apple or whatever the default profile is. But then if you've gone and you've calibrated that screen, at the end of that process, it sets that monitor profile as the one to use when you're using your screen. So if you've calibrated, it will be that profile. And when you're doing the monitor gamut warning in Lightroom, it uses whatever the active display profile is to do that representation.
Have you ever printed from Capture One?
I haven't. I know people who have. I haven't had the time to learn Capture One, but from what I hear, the printing interface is getting a lot more robust, and it's become a real useful tool.
Do you always allow Photoshop to handle color rather than the printer? And if so, why?
I do. And that is because if we allow the printer to manage colors, then it will only use color profiles from the default paper settings for that printer. So I have the Pro 300 selected. If I say printer manages colors, then what that does is with each of these media settings, and this doesn't matter what brand of printer you have. So each media setting that's been installed by the print driver has an associated color profile that's also been installed. It just doesn't show you that. So when I choose Pro Platinum and I have printer manages colors, it will use the Pro Platinum ICC profile to make that print. So if I'm not using Pro Platinum and I'm using, say, the Juniper or the Slickrock or the Luster, it's not going to be accurate because that profile is made for a different paper. So the only time you would use printer manages colors is if you were using one of the printer manufacturer's papers and you didn't want to specify your rendering intent or whatever else. So maybe you're making a bunch of quick 4x6s for somebody and you just want to throw them in and bulk print them, if you're using a Canon paper that you can pick in the driver, then it will be color accurate. But otherwise, you're sacrificing control and accuracy for speed. And Photoshop will even remind you that you've got to go in and change some other color settings in order to use that way.
What about the environment that you work in while processing your images? For example, the color of the wall and the luminance.
Yeah. So I talk about this a lot in the color management webinar that we have recorded, but you want to do your best to not work in a room with bright or saturated wall colors, whites, grays, more neutrals, because if you work in an environment that is, say, yellow or aqua green or pink or whatever, it's going to change your perception of what white is, and you're going to end up tinting your images one direction or the other because of all the ambient light that's a different color. You also want to, as much as you can, avoid something with a lot of harsh side light that's going to maybe shine on your screen or whatever, and change that. And then, of course, with all these new computers, you want to turn off the auto brightness and the true tone or night shift that will change the color of your screen unbeknownst to you based on the time of day or whatever else. That can also cause some havoc in your editing. You want control over all the parameters so that you know if anything changes.
What are common printing sizes for selling prints at, say, a frame? I think it's a framer's market. I used to print full bleed 13 by 19 and later 12 by 18, but see now that those are not easy to find custom or non-custom matting and framing solutions. Any thoughts on best sizes for selling prints using a 13-inch wide printer?
I think, first of all, the best size is one that's not kind of daunting, because you have to keep in mind, and it sounds like you have, you sell a print that's maybe 12 by 18, but if the customer is going to mat that and frame that, it's going to end up in, maybe a 20 by 28-inch frame or something, significantly larger. The other kind of sad thing is with the loss of a lot of maybe local frame shops or things like that, a lot of your pre-cut mats and stuff, you're just going to have to end up ordering online, maybe more in bulk, because that's the only place to find, say, a 12 by 18 or smaller, 8 by 12 pre-cut mat. So I would say it's going to depend on a lot of factors, but be a little not conservative, but have your sizes in mind, see what sells and what's popular, kind of query your customers as you're talking with them, hey, is this a good size? Would something a little smaller fit better? And then find a vendor that will get you those framing materials that you need in the sizes that you need. And that'll be, I would hesitate to sell anything larger than 12 by 18, because again, once you frame it, it gets really big. And even something a step down from that, I'm trying to do the math on the fly. An 8 by 12 is a full frame 3 by 2 image, or something in between. That would be like a 10 by 15 or something. But you also want to do your customers a favor, and whatever the outside dimension, if you're selling them matted, make sure that the outside dimension of that mat is a common frame size. So whatever store that they like to go to, increasingly a department store or mail order, they can easily find that frame size, and you're not having them go to a custom framer because your mat is 10.5 by 16.25 or something that they're never going to find anywhere off the shelf.
What does the black point compensation do?
Yeah, so black point compensation, again, you're only going to use that with relative colorimetric. But what it does is it takes any shadow tones that are not pure black, but that are out of gamut or darker than the maximum black of the paper, and it moves those into the printable gamut so that your shadows retain detail.
How do you disable printer handles color on the Canon printer?
So that's all done in your software. We go back to Photoshop. and then to print. And this is going to be the same no matter what program you're in. You're going to have the color handling. You simply disable printer manages colors by saying Photoshop manages colors and then picking your output profile. And many versions ago, there was a second step that could still apply to you depending on what software you're using. Is so here we have color handling, Photoshop manages colors. I picked my profile. And then it used to be you'd have to go into your printer settings, and generally under quality and media, you can see here it says rendering intent, no color correction, and it's grayed out. So that happens because Photoshop is able to override the print settings in the driver. So that's not a feature, but many editions ago I think in CS4, so that was a long time ago, you would have to go in here and manually select no color correction so it didn't get double profiled through the software, but that hasn't been a consideration for quite a while.
What should my color profile on my iMac monitor be set to, Mac or Adobe RGB?
That's a bit of a misnomer. I would set it, if you haven't done the calibration, I would set it to the iMac profile or whatever it shipped with, because if you set the monitor to Adobe RGB, your monitor, that display can't actually display the Adobe RGB color space. So I don't 100% know what it's doing with those settings.
Okay, just a few more questions. When you print a lot, is it important to ventilate the room and get rid of the vapors?
With standard inkjet, it's not. First of all, the vapors are not harmful. Second of all, for a print of this size, your printer is using about a milliliter of ink, which is, like 1 square centimeter. So there's very little liquid going in, and it evaporates pretty slowly, and it doesn't even, you don't even smell it when you print it. So no, there's no danger. If you're using like a solvent printer or other things like that, that's a totally different ink technology and everything else. But no, for standard inkjet, you don't have to worry about indoor air quality or anything else like that.
And we're going to end on this question. What happened to the print dialog box in Ventura OS? He's not finding many options.
So my guess is that when you upgraded, if you reinstalled your print driver, it automatically installed it as an AirPrint printer. And this has been a real challenge with Mac. So let's look at that last. And again, I'm going to go back to Photoshop to show you sort of the symptoms of this and then how to fix it. So if I go to print, the Pro 300 that I've been using, you can see there's a couple here in my list. So I'm going to start with the one I've been using. I have my profile set. I'm going to go to print settings. And you'll really see this if you go to, say, quality and media. Here I have media type, paper source, print quality. I have all the Canon media settings in here. Everything looks as I would expect it to. So if I cancel out of here and I go to one of these other Pro 300s, and I go back to print settings, I'm presented with media and quality, which I didn't have before, layout, cover page. So suddenly I've lost all those media settings that I'm looking for. I've lost kind of my quality. All I have here is, what is it, draft to best. So this tells me that it's using the generic Apple driver. And so to confirm that, I'm going to go to System Preferences, Printers and Scanners. And if I look over on the side here, Pro 300, so this was the good one. And here under Kind and Pro 300 series. So if I go to the second one, here it says Kind, Canon Pro 300 series AirPrint. So this is what is the Achilles heel of this thing. There's no way to change this. What you have to do is you have to delete it. and then you'll go back to the plus to add it. And don't add it if there's a little shortlist that pops up without a window. Don't add it through that. You have to go to this full window. You have to select your printer. And at least with whichever this is Monterey. So this is the one behind Ventura. I was finding out that even if it said Pro 300 here by default, it would still load as an AirPrint. So I found that I have to go into select software. I have to select specifically the Pro 300 series driver and then hit add, and then it will add it using the Canon driver and giving you all of those options. So be aware, go check every time you add a printer and make sure it says Canon Pro 300 series and not AirPrint.
Great. And I think you mentioned this throughout the webinar, but we do have a ton of videos that go more in depth with some things like color management and soft proofing. So check those out on our YouTube channel. And let us know what else you want to learn more about, because we'll integrate that into the year.
For sure. We appreciate everybody taking the time and sharing their questions and playing along. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And thank you, Evan. Happy New Year.
Of course. Hey, thanks.